they came with swords into a holy place. 4 knights, armored and angry, pushing open the doors of a cathedral where the echoes of prayer still hung in the air. They were not there for glory. They were there for a man. And by killing him, they would turn him into a saint. This is the story of how one king's careless words, spoken in frustration, unleashed a murder that shook medieval Europe and created one of the most powerful martyrs in Christian history. The year was 1170. The place, Canterbury, the spiritual heart of England. And the man at the center of the storm was Thomas Becket, once the king's closest friend, now his greatest enemy. To understand how blood came to stain the stones of Canterbury Cathedral, we must first go back to a time when church and crown were locked in a dangerous embrace. In the 12th century, England was still healing from civil war. King Henry II, young, brilliant, and relentlessly energetic, had clawed his way to the throne and was determined to rebuild royal authority. He wanted order, law, control, a kingdom that answered to him. But there was one power in his realm that did not bend easily to royal command: the church. Church courts tried their own cases. Clergy accused of crimes could escape secular punishment. Bishops answered to Rome as much as to the king. To Henry, this was a state within a state, and a dangerous one. So he made a decision that seemed at the time perfectly logical. He would place his most trusted friend at the head of the English church. Thomas Becket had risen from relatively modest origins to become Henry's chancellor, the king's right-hand man. He was brilliant, charming, and fiercely loyal. Together, they hunted, feasted, laughed, and governed. They were inseparable. Becket, as chancellor, had defended royal interests with a ruthless efficiency. He wore fine clothes, threw lavish banquets, and lived like a noble. No one doubted where his loyalties lay. So, when the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1162, Henry saw an opportunity. If Becket became Archbishop, the church would finally be tamed. The king and the primate of England working in perfect harmony. Becket resisted. He warned Henry that once he wore the archbishop's robes, his duty would be to God, not to the crown. But Henry insisted, and in a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Thomas Becket accepted. Almost immediately, everything changed. The moment Becket was consecrated, the silk and jewels vanished. He adopted an austere life, fasting, praying, wearing hair shirts beneath his robes. More importantly, he transformed politically. The man who had once defended royal power now became the fiercest champion of church independence. When Henry tried to impose reforms limiting clerical privilege, Becket resisted. When the king demanded that priests accused of crimes be punished in royal courts, Becket said no. Their friendship curdled into hostility. The conflict came to a head in 1164 with the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of laws meant to define the boundaries between church and state. Henry demanded Becket's compliance. Becket, under pressure, briefly agreed, then withdrew his support, claiming it violated the rights of the church. To Henry, this was betrayal. The king raged. The court watched in silence as the ruler's temper flared. Accusations flew, charges were brought. Becket, fearing imprisonment or worse, fled into exile in France. For 6 long years, the archbishop lived abroad, a thorn in Henry's side, writing letters, rallying the pope, and threatening excommunication against the king's allies. Europe watched as the quarrel between king and priest escalated into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Finally, in 1170, a fragile peace was arranged. Becket returned to England. But reconciliation was an illusion. Within weeks, he clashed again with royal authority, excommunicating bishops who had crowned Henry's son without his permission. News of this reached the king in Normandy. Henry exploded. In a moment of fury, the kind born of exhaustion, wounded pride, and years of frustration, he uttered words that would become infamous. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" It was not an order. But in a medieval court, it did not need to be. 4 knights heard the king's outburst and took it as a command. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton. They armed themselves. They crossed the Channel. They rode hard for Canterbury. On December 29th, 1170, as winter light faded and the cathedral bells called monks to prayer, the knights arrived. They confronted Becket in his palace, demanding that he lift the excommunications. He refused. Tempers flared. Voices rose. The knights withdrew, but only to arm themselves. When they returned, swords in hand, the monks tried to bar the cathedral doors. Becket would not allow it. "This is a house of prayer," he said, "not a fortress." They followed him into the north transept. There, beneath towering stone and flickering candlelight, the confrontation reached its end. The knights shouted for him to submit. Becket stood his ground. "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church," he declared, "I am ready to embrace death." The first blow struck his shoulder. The second cut deep into his skull. A third shattered his crown, both the physical one and the spiritual. Blood spilled across the floor of the cathedral. With a final strike, his head was split and his brain scattered on the stones. Thomas Becket was dead. Silence followed. The killers fled, leaving behind a corpse and a crime that would echo across Christendom. News of the murder spread like wildfire. The idea that an archbishop had been slain in his own cathedral by agents of a Christian king was unthinkable. Almost immediately, Becket was hailed as a martyr. Reports of miracles began to circulate. The sick claimed healing at his tomb. The blind claimed sight. Pilgrims poured into Canterbury in their thousands, then tens of thousands. Within 3 years, the Pope canonized Thomas Becket as a saint. And what of Henry II? The king was horrified. Whether he had intended violence or not, the world held him responsible. His reputation, his soul, his authority were all at stake. In 1174, in a scene as dramatic as the murder itself, Henry performed public penance at Canterbury. Barefoot, dressed as a penitent, he walked through the streets to the cathedral. He knelt at Becket's tomb and allowed the monks to scourge him. The most powerful king in Western Europe, whipped in public for the death of the man he had once called friend. The political consequences were just as profound. The cult of St. Thomas of Canterbury became one of the greatest pilgrimage movements in medieval Europe. His shrine, later rebuilt in gold and jewels, rivaled Rome itself. Kings and commoners alike sought his intercession, and the balance of power shifted. Becket's death did not destroy royal authority, but it reminded every monarch in Europe that the Church had its own weapons: martyrdom, moral outrage, and the ability to turn political defeat into spiritual victory. A single impulsive sentence had created a symbol more powerful than any army. Centuries later, pilgrims would still walk the road to Canterbury, telling the story of the archbishop who defied a king and paid with his life. Henry II went on to rule for years, but he never escaped the shadow of that winter evening. The stones of the cathedral were scrubbed, but the memory remained. A friendship turned to rivalry. A quarrel turned to exile. A burst of anger turned into a martyrdom. And from that pool of blood on the cold floor of Canterbury rose a saint whose legacy would shape church, crown, and conscience for generations. The echoes of that decision would shape the next 500 years of history.